Meet Professor Brian McNair of the Queensland University of Technology. Yeah, that's right, the same university that engages in segregation by segregating Indigenous students from the rest of the student population. McNair has a PhD in sociology, which should make you immediately suspicious, but his listed discipline is journalism and professional writing. So this man is responsible for educating an up-and-coming generation of journalists. And on March 6th, McNair penned an article educating us all about the phenomenon of fake news on the government-funded Conversation website, titled, funny enough, Fake News, a User's Guide. Quote, "With Zelig-like serendipity, I was in Stockholm when hashtag Last Night in Sweden went viral. While echoing the melancholic majesty of a classic ABBA song title, the hashtag Last Night in Sweden actually referred to yet another Donald Trump dump of alleged fake news on an increasingly exhausted world." At his first rally as US president, Trump declared, "We've got to keep our country safe. You look at what's happening last night in Sweden. Sweden. Who would believe this? Sweden. They took in large numbers. They're having problems like they never thought possible." Now, a lot of people did stories on this at the time. If you're not familiar with the story by now, Trump was basically referring to a Fox News interview with a documentary filmmaker who went to Sweden and reported on the escalating amount of crime in Sweden that Trump had seen the night before. Here's an excerpt from Dave Cullen's video.
Last night in Sweden. So these 4 words were deliberately misrepresented by the mainstream in the press, on TV, and by his opponents all over social media as him referring to a terrorist attack, a specific attack that must have taken place in Sweden the night before the rally. They said Trump makes reference to a non-existent terrorist attack, except how did you glean that from these 4 words?
Last night in Sweden.
Now, Trump later clarified his statements on Sweden. He was referring to a Fox News report, which was from the night before the rally he was speaking at. So last night in Sweden probably should have been, last night I saw a report about Sweden. Now, the reality is the remark may have misled some people, but it was based on actual facts.
Well, in Sweden's own words, they consider themselves to be a humanitarian superpower. They feel it's their moral duty to open their borders to all and any refugees that want to come to them. It's difficult to get jobs. There's too many of them, but they have tremendous benefits there, which is why so many of these migrants are going to Sweden to begin with. There was an absolute surge in both gun violence and rape in Sweden once they began this open door policy. They know that this crime is happening. They can feel it. The statistics are clear. But they would refer to what is the root cause behind it and say, oh, it's just more, it happened to be more violence. It's men who are raping people, not the refugees. They'll make excuses for it. So they have these, and what they really become are no-go zones. These are areas that cops won't even enter because it's too dangerous for them. This is the policy of the National Police Authority in Sweden, that the government has gone out of its way to try to cover up.
So now let's listen to McNair's take. Trump, it appeared to most observers, was alleging that an act of Islamist terrorism had just occurred in that far-off Nordic land, one that was illustrative of the existential threat faced by the American people and from which only he and his immigration clampdown could save them. No, as one very astute commentator on McNair's article wrote, fake good faith is the problem with this article. Brian McNair throws us the crazy Trump statement about Sweden in paragraph 3 and then tells us Trump, it appeared to most observers, was alleging that an act of Islamist terrorism had just occurred in that far-off Nordic land. It only appeared to observers who wanted it to appear like that, and the misled readers who take what those observers say in good faith. Exactly. It only appeared that way for people that want to believe it. McNair goes on. It hadn't, of course. No atrocity had occurred in Sweden that weekend, Islamist or otherwise. It's true, there was a minor riot the evening after Trump's speech in the Stockholm suburb of Rinkeby, when 2 cars were burnt out and a policeman was yelled at by a man who was possibly Muslim. But it's more likely that Trump's remarks caused that ruckus than that he was reacting to it. Even Trump's most dedicated admirers don't believe he can foretell the future. So remember, the title of this article was Fake News, a User's Guide. Well, McNair sarcastically suggests that Trump's speech may have been the cause of the riots in Rinkeby. Well, McNair could have done some, basic journalism and found out what the cause of the riot actually was. Riot in Stockholm suburb after drug suspect is arrested. Swedish police on Tuesday were investigating a riot that broke out overnight in a predominantly immigrant suburb in Stockholm after officers arrested a suspect on drug charges. The clashes started late Monday when a police car arrested a suspect and people started throwing stones at them in Rinkeby, north of Stockholm. Unidentified people, including some wearing masks, also set cars on fire and looted shops. One officer was slightly injured when a rock hit his arm, and one person was arrested for throwing rocks, police spokesman Lars Byström said Tuesday. Some civilians who tried to stop the looters were also assaulted, he added. So who is the purveyor of fake news? McNair then spends the bulk of the rest of this article railing against cherry-picked examples of what he thinks represents fake news. All happen to be right-wing sources, of course, very objective. And then towards the end, finally mentioned that Trump's comments were referring to the Fox News interview, which he dismisses without having seen it, because of some comments his students made. Again, I'm going to refer to the excellent comments that appeared in the comments section of this article. It's a 60-paragraph article. Mr. McNair doesn't even refer to the TV documentary on migration in Sweden, which Trump was possibly referring to, until paragraph 50. The natural flow of the article would have had that salient fact running at about paragraph 4 or 5 if the writer was being balanced and fair. The old saying, never let the truth get in the way of a good story, comes to mind. He then spends the next 10 paragraphs discrediting the documentary, which he apparently hasn't seen, although he casually calls it crap journalism anyway, because one of his students told him that one of the policemen featured claimed he'd been taken out of context, and anyway, the documentary maker, according to the student, was a far-right activist. So this is an aptly named article. It is a user's guide to fake news, but not in the way McNair intended. McNair is the source of fake news. And one more observation that may explain McNair's bias. On November 20th last year, McNair penned an article incredibly titled, given the content, After Objectivity, in which he concludes, this descent into normalisation of the hitherto unacceptable, occasioned by Trump's democratically endowed seizure of political power as of November 8, is very similar to the rise of Hitler and the Nazis in 1930s Germany. There it is. Whee! And apart from employing the most overused false comparison of modern politics, how does one seize power if he was democratically endowed? And how about the rewriting of history? Hitler never won a majority in any election. He was simply installed as Chancellor and then handed the title of President. Hitler's ascent and all that came from it was a product of free choices made in ballot boxes and of free media coverage which moved to the extreme right with the ruling party. Then as now, a demagogic populist exploited perceptions of victimhood and anti-elitism targeting ethnic and religious minorities as the enemy. No one forced National Socialism on the German people or on their media, nor on the many Western media such as the Daily Mail in England that spoke out in his favour. Post-November 8, the mainstream media have shown their inability to engage with an enormity of what is happening in Western and global politics within conventional paradigms of objectivity. Left to them, the slide into fascism will simply become another news story. Another, he said, she said performance of balance, legitimised by the fact that this is what democracy has delivered. No matter that in the 1930s, the same obeisance led to the Holocaust. What a load of left-wing hysterical nonsense. But in defence of McNair, he's only one amongst many that have succumbed to that new disease that seems to be sweeping certain parts of the mainstream media. I speak, of course, of TDS, or Trump Derangement Syndrome.
Well, America is crying tonight. I'm not sure how much of America, but a very, very significant portion, and I mean literally crying.
Everybody is crying and so upset, and it is the end of their world.
Feels like the end of the world.
We were on Lifetime last night, and I was slowly getting drunk is what happened to me.
How do we explain how this is possible?
How did this happen? experienced politician versus racist fake gynecologist.
Get your abortions now, because we're going to be fucked, and we're going to have to live with it.
You're awake, by the way. You're not having a terrible, terrible dream. Also, you're not dead and you haven't gone to hell. This is your life now. This is our election now. This is us. This is our country.
This is a different Earth today than it was 24 hours ago. It's a different place. It just is different.
The woman who President Obama called the most qualified person ever to run for the White House couldn't break through. The question remains, who can?
Deeper concerns tonight that the world's shining light of democracy has gone dark.
And that's it, really. McNair is just one of those emotionally compromised, hysterical leftists. So if you're after objectivity, don't bother with Brian McNair, especially if you're unfortunate enough to be one of his students. And if you enjoyed this content, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, or consider supporting me on Patreon. See you next time.